Yoshi, Legend of the Goombas. It's kind of weird to think about the idea of such a game existing. I wonder how different things would have been if Croc had actually ended up being a Yoshi game instead. I mean, sure, the game itself might have inherently felt different, both aesthetically and mechanically. I'm willing to bet Nintendo would have pushed Argonaut games toward controls closer to Mario 64, while also asking them to implement things like the flutter jump and eggs. But even beyond that, could it have killed Yoshi if it did poorly? Could it have expanded his gameplay into games like Sunshine had the game done well? Would Argonaut games still be making Nintendo games to this day as another HAL Laboratories sort of second-party developer? Would they have continued making Star Fox, and could they have maybe become a second Rare for Nintendo? Argonaut was also pretty tech-focused. Could games as a whole be different if they'd have gotten the constant high amounts of funding from a publisher like Nintendo? Things to ponder. As a kid, I really loved Croc. It was one of my first 3D games, and for that, it will always hold a special place in the game collection. Hint hint, go watch Super Derek RPGs if you don't already, because his content is great. But in reality, it will really always hold a special place in my heart. Now that I have a critical eye for games though, I've found that Croc has some majorly frustrating elements. Tank controls, boring bosses, an iffy camera, and some cheap platforming elements. Not all of them are net negatives. Some of them are just outdated and, while perfectly functional, require putting your brain in a time machine. It's not an easy game to 100%, and I almost chose not to do so for this review. If I hadn't gotten 90% of the gobos in the fourth world without much effort, you would have probably heard me talking about how I put a cheat in to play through the secret fifth world. How would that future be different from this one? Croc, Legend of the Gobos is a third-person platformer for pretty much everything but the Nintendo 64, which was released on the 29th of September in 1997 in North America. It was developed by Argonaut Games, famous for the creation of the original Star Fox and the Super FX chip it required to run on the Super Nintendo. Croc was published by Fox Interactive. Croc's story is a simple one. By the way, you're going to hear the word Croc a lot. Croc is found as a baby by the Gobos, a race of tiny little fuzzball creatures. The Gobos raise him the same way they would any of their own young. One day, however, an evil monster known as Baron Dante shows up, captures the Gobos, and takes over their land. Croc is then tasked with freeing his brethren and taking down Dante. While Croc's story is simple, the story of Croc is not. This game genuinely was almost a Yoshi game. And if you squint, you can see the pieces. Yoshi is one day found by the Goombas, a race of peaceful roasted chestnuts that look like mushrooms. They raise him as their own until one day an evil monster known as Bowser comes to take over. Using his army of corrupted Goombas from other lands, he captures the good Goombas to turn them evil, leaving Yoshi to save the day. Pretty uncanny, right? The designs resemble each other, some of the names are even similar. That Yoshi game is still in there somewhere. But alas, we're here to talk about Croc, not Yoshi, and that's exactly what we're going to do. Croc is a bit of a relic from the mid-90s. Super Mario 64 may have been released almost exactly a year before Croc, but there are strong reasons to believe that Croc as a project was experimenting with 3D movement long before then. Regardless, hindsight is 2020, and just because Mario 64 is heralded as the pinnacle of 32-bit 3D platformer design doesn't mean that people at the time didn't believe they could do it better. After all, Mario 64 wasn't perfect, so Croc tried to do its own thing to mixed results. Platformer trends be damned. The strangest thing about Croc is that it actually utilizes a form of tank controls. Instead of being able to yank Croc instantly in whatever direction you point the D-pad, left and right are purely used for rotating, with up and down being forward and backwards. This means maintaining a heading is super precise in Croc, but deviating from it in any way is slow and clunky. Croc does have some ways to deal with this in his arsenal, however. Holding back and pressing circle will cause Croc to do a quick 180, which can also be activated when in a full sprint, complete with a really cool animation. Croc also has some pretty great mid-air control, and a strafing maneuver using L1 and R1 when you're on the ground. In a decision that seems counterintuitive to the mind of a designer but totally makes sense while you're playing, strafing in the air is actually swapped with rotating, so suddenly left and right move Croc left and right, with L1 and R1 rotating him. Croc's other controls are fairly common tropes for the genre. He can use a tail whip attack, and a ground pound if you hit the jump button again while in the air. This ground pound has two different states to it. Simply pressing the jump button while in the air will cause Croc to ground pound until he hits an object. If that object is breakable, he'll then revert back to the falling state. If you instead hold the button though, he'll continue to ground pound, breaking through every object he can until he hits totally solid collision. There are also a few segments where Croc is expected to swim. The only differences, however, are that the jump button now propels Croc forward. Up and down allow him to pitch up and down, and he loses the ability to ground pound. Enemies in Croc are rather varied, though if I'm honest, most of them don't pose any sort of threat, and might as well not even be there. I'd say they're one of the biggest weaknesses of the design, since the most threatening thing about most of them is that they respawn after about 10 seconds. There are a handful though, which can be put in really frustrating places. Croc is otherwise pretty typical in mechanical design. You've got keys to unlock things, you find colored crystals to unlock secret areas at the end of every level, and find gobos to unlock entire secret levels. There's even a secret world if you find them all. There are further secrets to find that even lead to extra lives. Collecting normal crystals can also give Croc extra lives if he gets over 100. Crystals also serve as Croc's health in a way exactly like rings work in the Sonic games. Level design in Croc, meanwhile, is really segmented into individual cells to explore. Every 15 seconds to 3 minutes or so, you'll be entering a new cell, with the average time spent usually being around 45 seconds. Loading times are lightning fast, so it's not really an issue in terms of level pacing, but it does feel a bit detached and gamey. The overall design of the game is competent, though there is the sense that the dev team built some challenges with their expertise in mind, rather than trying to teach players said expert techniques first. There are a few points in Croc where you as the player might feel like the game is actively working against you, almost like it's trolling. It will often leave the player without knowledge that they may need to progress effectively. You're never really left unable to continue without such knowledge, but going without it can feel like an insurmountable task. The biggest offender, I would say, is the fact that Croc can maintain altitude and start progressing forward after a single ground pound that destroys a block below him. The first time this shows up is fairly early on, where the secret area in a level presents you with a bridge made up of 10 or so boxes. Below it is an area you can't return from, and in only one of these boxes does there hide the final gobo you need to fully complete the level. What you're supposed to do is get right to the edge of each box, do a soft ground pound so that you revert to falling after you break the box, and then hold forward. Because Croc won't actually start falling right away, there are a few frames where you can hold forward. Croc will then make it to the top of the next box instead of falling down. This is not something the game makes any attempt to teach you, and it later shows up again in a level where there are a bunch of bridges made of boxes, each with an invincible enemy on them. The player needs to break one of the boxes, so the enemy will fall to its doom. Only when you do this can you get the key required to move to the next room. Again, this technically isn't required to beat the game, because it's in a level in the secret world, but it still feels kind of unfair. Croc likes to troll players in other ways too. It often places really difficult final bits behind gem doors, and as the last challenges before said gem doors. It will regularly use one chance design for collecting colored gems or gobos, requiring you to do levels over and over again to fully complete them. It is far worse than the way Klonoa does it. Remember when I said a few enemies can put you in really frustrating places? Well, the game also often trolls the player with enemies who shoot projectiles, sitting around in areas where you don't have access to gems to keep yourself alive. I think I finally learned near the end that you can avoid their fire if you do a full jump, and only a full jump, as you approach them. But even still, it feels unfair. Croc also loves its minigames, but they're rather hit or miss. Some of them, particularly the ones where you have to move around a cauldron, last far too long. And in the case of that minigame, one mistake means you need to do the entire level over again. There's even a level that is just back-to-back minigames. It's a great way to farm lives if you need them, and it's a nice change of pace, but it's otherwise frustrating that you have to perfect so many minigames in succession in order to 100% complete the level. Another issue is that some areas of ground have sloped edges, which cause Croc to start sliding down toward hazards. This makes judging jumps needlessly hard, because touching the slope will eat your inputs. Some moving platforms also seem to have magnetic properties, meaning Croc will start moving with them as soon as his body is over them during a jump. He doesn't have to be touching them at all. This can lead to the player overcompensating because they think they have to manually follow the platform. Manually moving your character with these platforms isn't only instinct based on other moving platforms in the game, but it's also just general platformer instinct, and these platforms go against that. Croc may have some issues when it comes to gameplay and design, but the presentation is largely fantastic. The game looks great for the time, and still holds up about as well as you would hope. It also runs pretty well even today. Levels often feel repetitive, manufactured, cramped, and sometimes empty, but if you're not expecting it to immerse you in the world, and instead are just looking for some good old platforming challenges, this isn't really an issue. Sound design is pretty sweet as well. I personally kind of enjoy how everything seems to have an adorable, squeaky voice, including Croc himself. The naive innocence of most of these characters is super charming. Music, meanwhile, is pretty fantastic here, though a lot of it is based on the same couple melodies arranged in different ways with different instruments. That might bother some, but I'm fine with it because the melodies are so good. Then again, you also don't get to hear a ton of the music for long, because it resets and changes with each new cell you enter. It's not often that you get to hear a whole loop of a track, which is unfortunate. So is Croc a good game? I know a lot of the internet would want you to believe that it's terrible, and their reasons for thinking so are definitely not unfounded. There were many times over the 6 or so hours I played this game for the review where I was audibly frustrated. I was kind of on the fence with where I stood on this game. But I still think in the end it's a game that's mostly playable even today, if not also incredibly awkward. It's a relic of its time period. While it was difficult to 100%, it wasn't near as difficult as I thought it would be, meaning it's not too hard to see all of the content on offer. For the $5 I spent on a complete copy in fantastic condition about 3 months ago, because this is one of the games when I was a kid that I traded to get Klonoa, I'd say Yoshi, Legend of the Goombas was a pretty good time. Hey, thanks for watching this video. If you're interested in another one, here's the last one that I uploaded. You can also follow me on Twitter or subscribe by hitting the subscribe button.